Okay. All right. So, welcome everyone to the March theme, new month, new theme. And happy Women's History Month to everyone. So, what I would usually do is introduce the theme, but I actually want to start off with a prompt tonight. So, I want to ask you all, what comes to mind when you hear the term wilderness experience or when you think of the physical wilderness? And you can either come off mute or put your thoughts in the chat, but feel free to come off mute. So the question
for a time of growth, yeah.
I was going to say, for me, just a time in which I don't necessarily know what's going to happen, what's the outcome. Like, I'm leaning totally on faith. It's outside of my expertise.
Okay.
Man, I think about being thrown in a jungle in the wilderness with, I'm a city boy, you know what I'm saying? So I don't even like going down south and back east a lot because I feel like all those trees make me feel like I'm in the woods and I don't like that feeling. So when I think of the wilderness, I think of nature and I don't like it like that.
I hear you. You don't be going on tours in national parks, Rose? Nah,
Nope. I like the concrete jungle.
I feel you.
Man, y'all need to spend some time in the country, man. It'll make you better.
I'd have to agree with Carlos. I feel like that's being stuck out there in the wild and with no hope or help.
Mm. Got you. Ashley Roundtree in the chat says the country is peaceful. Anybody else? Omar?
Discomfort. Yeah, I would say being out your comfort zone, being in a new environment, new situation, and being in a place that you're not familiar with. So you're just doing your best to try to navigate and it's trying to survive and make the most out of it.
Mm. Yep. And then Ayana in the chat says wilderness equals seclusion. Nice. All right. Thank you all for doing that with me. Let's go ahead and get started. So as I prepared for this lesson, I asked myself the same question. And when I reflected on the physical wilderness experiences in the Bible, and my own figurative wilderness experience, two main categories emerged. So the first made me think about the difficulty and lack in the wilderness. So things like desolation, trials, temptation, challenge, hardship, vulnerability to elements in wildlife, and being away from the comfort and amenities of my home came to mind. And when I thought about it from that perspective, I didn't want any parts of the physical wilderness nor figurative wilderness experiences. And, for the purposes of the lesson tonight, I define figurative wilderness experiences as trials of life, which include loss of loved ones, estranged relationships, illness, job loss, financial challenges, difficult life transitions, legal problems, natural disasters, pandemic, and wars. Alternatively, though, I thought about God's handiwork displayed through the physical wilderness, and specifically how he created a vast and diverse world out of void. I also reflected on the beauty of his creation and how he provides for plants, animals, and people in wilderness terrains. And with regard to figurative wilderness experiences, I thought about how God's divine presence covers and carries during those periods, and how it can be the birthplace for spiritual maturation, refinement, knowledge, and wisdom. And this second category helped me see the purpose and benefit of the wilderness. So, and I forgot to click the slide. So these are just like pictorial representations. You know, the first where I talked about like desolation and like trials and things like that is how I pictured the wilderness on the left. And then when I thought about, you know, God's handiwork and like the purpose in it is what I pictured on the right. So for this month's theme, I want to acknowledge the difficulty of the wilderness, but we will primarily focus on God's divine presence and ways to access and exercise wisdom during wilderness experiences. We will study the wilderness experience of 4 people in the Bible. All 4 faced figurative wilderness experiences in the physical wilderness. And the goal of the theme is to explore wilderness. The goal of the theme is to explore wisdom displayed in each example in order to seek and apply wisdom during our own wilderness experiences. And for tonight's lesson, we're going to start by covering Hagar's wilderness experience. So before we discuss Hagar, let's briefly cover the events that led to her wilderness experience. I'm going to give a brief overview of relevant events in the lives of Abram and his wife Sarai, but if you want more details, read Genesis 12:23. And I'm referring to them as Abram and Sarai because the text that we're covering, that was their name at the time, but we know in Genesis 17, God changed their names to Abraham and Sarah. So in Genesis 12, God promised to make Abram into a great nation and give the land of Canaan to his offsprings. He called Abram to leave his home in Haran and go to Canaan. Abram and Sarai answered the call and went. They briefly left Canaan and went to Egypt during a period of famine. And while they were in Egypt, they acquired many possessions, which likely included an Egyptian slave named Hagar. In Genesis 15, when they were back in Canaan, God reassured Abram of his promise and made a covenant with Abram that his descendants would be given the land of Canaan. And then by Genesis 16, Abram and Sarai still haven't been able to conceive. So Sarai suggests that Abram has a child with Hagar, Sarai's Egyptian slave. Abram agrees and Hagar conceives and becomes pregnant. So who is Hagar? Hagar's name means flight, and Hagar is a woman, an Egyptian, and therefore a foreigner who was apart from the care of her family. She was Sarai's slave, a mother-to-be. She served as a surrogate for Sarai. And when I think about all these categories, women, foreigner, slave, unmarried or single mother, they're all examples of marginalized groups that were vulnerable to mistreatment and unprotected during biblical times. And these groups still actually are today to a certain extent. And Hagar's vulnerability was compounded because she occupied several of these marginalized groups. So what events led to Hagar's wilderness experience? So Hagar has 2 wilderness experiences, and we'll look at the first, which is covered in Genesis 16, and we may briefly discuss the second in Genesis 21 if we have time. But let's just get started at Genesis 1 through 16, which covers the events that led to Hagar's first wilderness experience. It reads, "Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, 'The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her.' Abram agreed to what Sarai said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, 'You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she's pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me. Your slave is in your hands,' Abram said. 'Do with her whatever you think best.' Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her." So the actions of Abram, Sarai, and Hagar preceded Hagar's wilderness experience, which we'll get to soon. Abram and Sarai's decision to operate outside of God's will led to a contentious relationship between Sarai and Hagar. Hagar despised Sarai and Sarai mistreated her. And just want to stop to say that our personal wilderness experiences can be prompted by many things, but everyone that lives long enough will encounter wilderness experiences. And regardless of the cause, as we will see, there is purpose for these periods and God can always redeem it for good. So now we'll look at Hagar's wilderness experiences. And since we're going to talk about wilderness wisdom, I'm going to share a few wilderness wisdom lessons that we can learn from Hagar's experience, but it won't be an exhaustive list because I also want to know what you all see as well. So Genesis 16, 7 through 13 covers Hagar's wilderness experience. Verse 7 and 8 pick up after Hagar flees. It says, the angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said, Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from? And where are you going? I'm running away from my mistress, Sarai answered. So after Hagar flees, we learn that she is found by a spring of water in the desert. And the word for desert in the text is Strong's H4057, which translates to wilderness in the Hebrew. So Hagar was found in the wilderness by an angel of the Lord. So we get to our first wilderness wisdom lesson, and that is that God is with you in the wilderness. Verse 7 says, the angel of the Lord found Hagar. The angel of the Lord appears to 9 people in the Bible: Hagar, Abraham, Moses, Balaam, Israel as a whole nation, Gideon, Samson's parents, David, and Elijah. And one commentary says that the angel of the Lord was a physical presence who spoke to Hagar as one person speaks to another. So the angel of the Lord is thought to be a theophany, which is a physical manifestation of God. The angel of the Lord first appeared to Hagar, and this is notable because based on worldly standards, she was an unlikely candidate for such a remarkable encounter. As previously mentioned, Hagar was vulnerable and unprotected as a foreign, unmarried, pregnant slave in the wilderness. And but in a period where she probably felt most alone and abandoned, God chose to reveal himself to her. The angel of the Lord called Hagar and Sarai by name, indicating knowledge of Hagar and the circumstances that led to her flight from her home. And the angel of the Lord made space to hear Hagar's fears and feelings about her condition. He asked, where'd you come from? Where are you going? And the fact that the angel of the Lord did all this and first appeared to Hagar communicates God's love for her and also other downtrodden people that are overlooked and mistreated by the world. So when you enter your figurative wilderness, don't forget that God is with you. I know this is a basic, simple truth, but it can be easily forgotten when times of extreme difficulty make us feel and operate like we're alone. God is with you. Remember that. And look for the many ways he makes his presence known in your life. It could be through a word, sermon, lesson, prayer, wise counsel of others, fellowship in nature, revelation from the Holy Spirit, or deeper understanding of Christ, or many other ways, but he makes his presence known. So let's pick back up at verse 9. Then the angel of the Lord told her, go back to your mistress and submit to her. The angel added, I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count. The angel of the Lord also said to her, you are now pregnant and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of man. His hands will be against everyone and everyone's hands against him. And he will live in hostility towards all his brothers. So wilderness lesson 2 is God will direct your wilderness experience. The angel of the Lord told Hagar to go back to Sarai. I don't know if that's what she was expecting to hear or wanting to hear, but although the angel of the Lord told Hagar to return to the same household, she was given a new strategy, which was submission. And that strategy seemed to have helped Sarai and Hagar's relationship because subsequent scriptures don't mention additional conflict directly between the women. So this just reminds me to be open to God's direction in the wilderness. Sometimes he will change people and circumstances. Other times you will remain in the same situation and he will call you to change. And then we can move on to wilderness lesson 3, which is reflect on God's promises in the wilderness. The angel of the Lord also gave Hagar a promise. God's covenant was designed for the offspring of Abram and Sarai. But when they operated outside of God's will, Hagar got thrust into the mix and was subject to the effects of their disobedience. God still carried out his original covenant with Abram and Sarai, but he also redeemed their actions by remembering Hagar and promising to give her numerous descendants as well. God's grace and mercy covered everyone, and God's promise gave Hagar hope and purpose. And the Bible is full of God's promises to us. During your wilderness period, meditate on God's promises and truths. Some of my go-tos are John 16:33, which says, I told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. And Matthew 11:28-30, which says, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. All right, so let's finish off the passage with verse 13, which says, she gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God who sees me. For she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. Wilderness lesson number 4 is the wilderness is a birthplace for deeper fellowship with God. So prior to Hagar's wilderness experience, we don't know if she had a relationship with God. Hagar could have had a relationship with God by virtue of being in the household with Abram and Sarai, or she could have served gods of her people or no God at all. But when Hagar went to the wilderness, she had a personal encounter with God. His presence, direction, and promise helped Hagar understand that he saw her. And upon this realization, Hagar calls God El Roi, one of the many names of God in the Bible, which translates to, you are a God who sees me. So she was transformed by her personal encounter with God, and regardless of if or how the world saw her, her wilderness experience showed her that God saw her. So there's no doubt that wilderness experiences are challenging. God knows that, and he wants us to tell him about the challenge. So be honest, open, vulnerable, and fully reliant on him. But don't get caught up in the challenge. Remember that challenge is an opportunity for triumph. The wilderness is also purposeful and fruitful. It's a space for spiritual maturation, refinement, knowledge, and deeper relationship with God. It's also a place where God's love, providence, and provision is on display. And as we discussed tonight, remember to embrace God's presence, accept his direction, meditate on his promises, and cultivate deeper fellowship with him during your wilderness experience. So I am wrapping things up now, but I want to leave you all with a couple of prompts to start discussion, but feel free to share whatever comes to mind. But in case you want some prompts for discussion, I put 2 on the screen. The first is, what other lessons do you see in Hagar's wilderness experience? And share one wise lesson you learned during your own wilderness experience. Thank you, everyone.